blast engines of the German Luftwaffe had fallen silent in May 1945. What remained was a scattered mass of wreckage, half-scrapped planes, abandoned factories, and unsalvageable war machinery, left to crumble in the wake of a war that had devastated not just nations, but entire ideologies. Luftwaffe, once a symbol of terror and technological advancement, now found itself at the center of a post-war world determined to both erase and repurpose its legacy. Across the broken landscapes of Europe, from Germany's war-torn cities to distant Allied zones of occupation, the fate of the Luftwaffe's remnants would unfold in ways that few could have predicted. By the end of the war, the Luftwaffe had suffered staggering losses. The estimated 100,000 aircraft the Luftwaffe had deployed during the war, fewer than 10,000 remained in any condition to be salvaged. Entire airfields were littered with wrecks. Some planes had crashed, others were abandoned, their pilots either killed or missing. The Luftwaffe's planes were often stripped for parts or left to rot in the open. Those that remained operational were too few to be of any strategic value. War had ended, and the surviving aircraft were irrelevant in a new world order that had no place for their aggressive design. With the surrender of Germany in May 1945, the Allies had to contend with the overwhelming logistical challenge of managing the wreckage left behind by the Luftwaffe. The sheer scale of the destruction and the sheer volume of surplus military equipment was nothing short of staggering. Plans were put in place for the systematic disposal of Germany's war assets, but the question was, what to do with these remnants of a failed empire? Thousands of aircraft bombers, fighters, reconnaissance planes, and transport craft would need to be accounted for. But the solution was not simple. The rapid post-war economic collapse and the disintegration of Germany meant that the country was no longer able to care for or maintain this massive arsenal. To make matters more complicated, the sheer cost of restoring or even storing these aircraft far exceeded Germany's ability to finance such efforts. Much of the workforce required to dismantle, repair, or repurpose these planes was simply no longer available. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied powers, chiefly the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union found themselves grappling with the question of what to do with the Luftwaffe's scattered remains. The answer came in a number of forms. The first response was simple: mass disposal. Craft were torn apart for scrap metal, a resource urgently needed for rebuilding shattered economies across Europe. The amount of usable material in a single bomber or fighter plane was considerable, and this metal would serve as a critical resource for the post-war reconstruction efforts. The Allies quickly set up processing plants specifically designed for dismantling the vast amounts of captured military machinery, including the Luftwaffe's planes. Yet, not all was so straightforward. The technological advances achieved by the Luftwaffe in the years leading up to and during the war made the surplus aircraft and components valuable. Germans had developed some of the most advanced aircraft designs in history, innovative fighters such as the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, and the Arado R-234, the first operational jet bomber. In many ways, these planes marked the future of aviation. The Allies had to decide whether to destroy these advanced designs or to preserve them for reverse engineering and research. British, for instance, took a keen interest in the Luftwaffe's jet technology. A number of Me-262s and their components were taken to Britain, where engineers painstakingly studied them for any breakthroughs that might have applications in post-war aviation. The United States, with its resources far more plentiful than Britain's, also sought to capitalize on German aviation innovations. While many of the Luftwaffe's aircraft were unceremoniously scrapped, select examples were sent to American military bases for further study. It is said that one of the primary reasons the US adopted the jet engine technology so swiftly in the post-war years was due to the intelligence gathered from these German aircraft. Obviously, other aircraft and components were being abandoned outright. In the chaos of the war's end, parts of the Luftwaffe's infrastructure had fallen into disrepair, and many planes were left to degrade in the elements. German airfields were left in such a state of ruin that it would be years before they could be repurposed for any use. Thousands of planes, particularly older, more obsolete models, were left sitting on the tarmac, their fate sealed in the rush to dismantle what remained of Germany's military machine. The scale of abandonment was not confined to the air. Germany's industrial base had been shattered by Allied bombing campaigns and the subsequent occupation, and production lines that once churned out the advanced warplanes were now silent, their skilled workers either gone or displaced. The process of dismantling the Luftwaffe's industrial network began almost immediately, as Allied forces sought to dismantle the remnants of the Nazi war machine. In many cases, these factories were not simply repurposed for civilian use, they were systematically destroyed to prevent any future military production. The Soviet Union meanwhile, took a different approach. In its occupied zone, Soviet forces dismantled the Luftwaffe's remnants and repurposed both the aircraft and the factories to suit their own military needs. Fiat engineers, like their Western counterparts, were quick to recognize the potential of German aviation technology. Some of the German aircraft, including the Me-262 and the Focke-Wulf Fw, were taken back to the Soviet Union for analysis and reverse engineering. The Soviets also stripped factories in their zone of occupation for machinery and tooling. These resources would later play a crucial role in the Soviet Union's own aircraft production in the years that followed. Despite the efforts of the Allies to capitalize on the remnants of the Luftwaffe, much of what had once been a cutting-edge force of destruction was now obsolete. Post-war economic pressures, combined with the growing tensions of the emerging Cold War, meant that there would be no place for these remnants in the New World Order. What was once a tool of war was now a drain on resources, a costly and unnecessary legacy of a defeated regime. Still, some of the aircraft would survive, not as military assets but as remnants of history. Some were put into museums or collected by aviation enthusiasts. Yet these examples were few and far between. The vast majority of the Luftwaffe's remains would be reduced to scrap. In a time when the world was rebuilding, and the economic pressures were overwhelming, the value of these planes was far outweighed by the pressing needs of the moment. The metal, the engines, the propellers, these became vital materials for rebuilding homes, factories, and cities rather than tools of war. The war ended and the world turned its attention to reconstruction. The question lingered. What would become of the Luftwaffe's scattered pieces? Would they be erased, forgotten, or would they have some purpose beyond their destructive past? The answers would come slowly, as the world adjusted to its new reality, but for the moment, the scattered remnants of the Luftwaffe were just another chapter of history, one of destruction, of collapse, and of the cold, inevitable march of time. Following the initial dismantling of the Luftwaffe, a sense of calm settled over the remains of what had once been a formidable force. Broken fuselages and crumpled airfields seemed like relics of a forgotten age, their significance fading as quickly as the memory of their destruction. Yet, as the world moved away from the heat of war, the question of what to do with the shattered remnants of Nazi Germany's military machine did not simply vanish. The task of dealing with these broken assets would unfold across several years, with each new decision shaping the fate of these aircraft and their parts in ways few could have anticipated. Early post-war years were marked by a need for economic stabilization, particularly for the nations that had borne the brunt of the war. Germany itself. The immediate focus was on survival, both of its people and its fractured economy. With much of its infrastructure destroyed, the country was left to rebuild in the midst of political turmoil. The Allies, though eager to turn their attention to their own recovery, found themselves still dealing with the aftermath of their military victory, dealing with the enormous quantities of military equipment, including the Luftwaffe's planes, that had been captured or left behind. In the years that followed, it became clear that the cost of fully dismantling or scrapping all the Luftwaffe's remnants was simply unsustainable. The Cold War began to take shape, with tensions rising between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. Both sides recognized the need to secure certain strategic assets. Among these were the technological advancements made by the Germans in aviation, which had advanced well beyond what any other country had achieved during the war. Though much of the Luftwaffe's aircraft were rendered obsolete by the end of the war, many of the designs that had emerged from Germany's wartime effort were still seen as potential game-changers. The Me-262, for example, had demonstrated the feasibility of jet-powered warfare, an idea that would dominate the skies in the coming decades. Despite its limited combat effectiveness during the war, the technological implications of the Me-262 were not lost on the Allies. The United States and the Soviet Union quickly moved to study and reverse engineer the aircraft, along with other key German designs. The Americans, through Operation Paperclip, brought German scientists and engineers to work on developing their own jet programs. The Soviets, similarly, made use of the captured aircraft and aircraft parts, working to adapt German designs to their own military needs. The Me-262 was not the only example of the Luftwaffe's innovative designs. The Arado R-234, the world's first operational jet bomber, was another aircraft that would find its way into post-war research programs. With its jet engines and cutting-edge radar, the R-234 was far ahead of anything the Allies had in their arsenal at the time. Several examples of the R-234 were captured by the Allies and shipped to Britain and the United States for analysis. Its technology would influence the development of jet bombers in the years that followed. The technological potential of these aircraft was one reason why many of the Luftwaffe's planes were not immediately scrapped, Despite the overwhelming pressure to dispose of them, the Allied powers recognized the strategic value of studying these aircraft in depth, learning from them, and integrating their technology into their own military programs. The result, rather than being erased entirely, some Luftwaffe aircraft would be preserved for future use, not as war machines, but as tools for technological development. The rise of the jet age in aviation was in no small part influenced by the advanced engineering found in these captured planes. Britain, for instance, the Royal Aircraft Establishment took possession of several Me-262s and began an intensive program of testing and evaluation. British were particularly interested in the engine technology of the Me-2062, as it represented the first serious application of jet propulsion in military aviation. Lessons learned from studying the Me-262 and other captured aircraft would shape British jet designs in the years to come. In the United States, meanwhile, the American military and civilian aviation sectors were similarly eager to exploit any advantage they could gain from these German designs. The Americans closely examined the German jet engines, which were far more advanced than their own at the time, and incorporated them into the development of the first generation of American jet fighters. However, despite the efforts of the Allies to salvage and study the technology, the majority of the Luftwaffe's remaining aircraft were doomed to the scrap heap. As some of the planes were preserved for study, the cost of maintaining or restoring large numbers of the aircraft was far too great to justify their retention. Economic pressures mounted as the focus shifted toward rebuilding the civilian economy. The aircraft that had once been symbols of German power now had little practical application in the post-war world. The resources required to store, maintain, or upgrade these planes were far better spent elsewhere. By the late 1940s, most of the Luftwaffe's aircraft had been reduced to scrap metal. The impact of this massive disposal effort was felt not only in Germany but across the world. The post-war economic climate left little room for nostalgia or preservation of the past. In fact, much of the destruction of German military assets, including aircraft, was seen as a necessary step in preventing any resurgence of militarism. The Allies were determined to ensure that Germany's military capabilities remained in check, not just through the dismantling of the Luftwaffe's remnants, but through the systematic destruction of the very infrastructure that had enabled such advanced military technology to be developed in the first place. However, not all remnants of the Luftwaffe were so easily erased. The destruction of many aircraft was not the end of their story. Aircraft were preserved in museums or kept in private collections, becoming valuable pieces of aviation history. The Me-2062, for example, would go on to become a centerpiece of aviation collections in both Europe and the United States. Its legacy, as the first operational jet fighter, would earn it a place of honor in the history of military aviation, even though it had never achieved the success the Germans had hoped for during the war. The aircraft, such as the Focke-Wulf 90, would find their way into civilian hands, where they were restored and displayed as examples of the technological achievements of wartime Germany. In many ways, these surviving aircraft became symbols of a time long past, a reminder of the destructive power of the war that had torn Europe apart. Their preservation was not an attempt to glorify the Nazi regime that had built them, but rather a recognition of the technical achievements that had been made, despite the horrors that surrounded them. The existence of these planes in museums and collections today serves as a reminder of the complexity of the post-war era, where both the need to dismantle and the desire to understand history often collided. In the decades following the war, as the Cold War intensified, the military-industrial complex of both the United States and the Soviet Union expanded dramatically. Superpowers had come to recognize the significance of the technology developed by the Germans during the war, and many of the lessons learned from studying the Luftwaffe's aircraft were applied to the development of new generations of military aircraft. The jet age had arrived, and the foundations of modern air warfare were being laid in the post-war period. Luftwaffe's broken remnants, scattered across Europe and the world, had played a role in that transition, though the planes themselves had no part in the wars that would follow.